Hello and welcome once again to the TooFatLardies 2025 Advent Calendar. Today is the 15th of December and once again we welcome Nick Skinner, who's going to open the next window on the calendar.
Hello, Nick here. Welcome to another door on the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2025. I hope your Christmas preparations are going fantastically well and that you've got your Christmas dinner lined up, your turkey, your goose, your venison, your roast beef, your boiled ham, your roast ham, and all those other goodies stockpiled waiting for you to enjoy very soon now. Washed down, I hope, with something that keeps you in the Christmas spirit just long enough to have a nice sleep in front of the fire after you've overindulged. And I hope you get a chance to do some good wargaming over this festive period. And I'd also just like to say at this point, while I have the opportunity, just to thank everyone for their support for what we've been doing at TooFatLardies over the last 12 months, and that we look very much to doing more exciting stuff in the new year. Now, today's entry on the Advent window, I'm going to have I'm going to get a bit of a soapbox, I think. And I think that there's something that I want to talk about, which is about, I've called it War Games rules and the purpose of intent, and why it does matter who writes the game. There is an uncomfortable truth, I think, in tabletop wargaming that we don't perhaps always like to talk about. And that is that not all rule books are written for the same reason. Some are written because we know that the designer is interested in the history as a wargamer and has something to say about that history, has an appreciation of the challenges of command, tabletop friction, decision making, and game narrative, and creating an experience that's fun and enjoyable with mechanisms that really work. And there are other rules that are written because somebody wants to sell you some toys. And at first glance, you know, when you pick up a rule set, when you look at the book or the whatever format it might take, you know, sometimes at first glance these things can look quite similar, but once you get them out of the box and start playing, you can get a very different gaming experience. And the reason for that is clear. The intent behind the two is profoundly different. Once you start noticing it, you know, it will probably change how you play your games. And I think I am speaking from a biased position, but I will take to my grave the belief that games that are designed by people who have that understanding, appreciation of history, the challenges of the command, the battlefield, narratives of the period, will create games that you will want to play for much longer. When rules are written by dedicated game designers, they normally start with a question. How did this kind of combat actually work? What decisions were being faced by the protagonists at the time? What doctrine was influencing how things worked? What was the way that these weapons were actually used on the battlefield? How did commanders struggle to keep the discipline of their men? How did they manage the accumulation of attrited shock and manage casualties on the battlefield? The rules are then built to answer those questions through the play. They're not chosen because they're fashionable, although I guess there are fashions that run in game design. There are some techniques and mechanisms that tend to run throughout rule sets because people know they work, and they often work across different historical periods. But they're chosen because of the tempo of the game that they might create. They're chosen because of the way that they reflect the period attitudes towards leadership, or maybe the game designer's attitudes towards leadership. They're chosen because they force you as a player to manage the risk of tabletop command, and because that there's a historically plausible outcome that they're trying to achieve. Then any set of good rules, every mechanic has a job of driving us closer to that outcome. It's the intent of the game designer, and of course their intent is to maximize that feeling. It's the feeling that they want to generate in you, and the outcome and the historical plausibility and relevance, I guess, of the game that really matters. Of course, and then that job isn't to sell you anything. You've already purchased what you need to purchase to play the game. You don't need to then go, that's great, I want to buy some more of this, that or the other and get that on the table. There are games we know that do that. So by contrast, some of those games, the game becomes about a different set of intent. The game is not about the outcomes and historical relevance and the historical plausibility. The game instead becomes a question of becomes built around a different set of questions. It becomes around questions like, how do we showcase the range? How do we give every unit a chance and a reason to exist? And how do we encourage players to make sure they buy the next release? And when we move away from historical games also, we become very, very caught up in that process. And of course, some games that cross over from historicals into non-historical settings, there's also great opportunity for that to take place there too. We can't recreate in historical games units and troop types that did not exist. And yet as soon as we cross into the fictional space or fantastical space, then we can start to create units and create games around how those new units might operate or dominate or become funky and super sexy on our war games tables. There's a massive difference. I think you can usually tell the difference as well when you're at the table. I think that in general, the games that are written by designers who have the historical intent tend to focus more on behaviour. They tend to focus more on formations and obviously historical accuracy. I think also in those games, players will probably feel a bit restricted in what they can do. This is where we like to take control away from players a bit more. Whereas in games that are driven by other motives, I think we tend to say that commanders are not constrained. They're actually allowed to do more, because if you do more, you can put more toys on the table to do it. You get more special abilities and more exceptions and more reasons just to add one more thing to your army. So the result is a game that feels busy, might have loads of stuff going on in it. It might even be really good fun at sometimes, but it actually feels quite hollow with very little meaning. So I think experienced designers know that realism doesn't come from having more toys on the table. Sometimes it comes from having fewer toys on the table. It comes from having the right degree of abstraction, and recognising that players don't need to control everything, and that breaking, giving them too much control, is a way of shattering the illusion of command. And I think this is where specialist rule writers kind of stand apart. It's their understanding of how players read and work systems. And I guess at times to say no to ideas that undermine that design. Say no to the idea of having a new mechanism that allows you to bring unrealistic unit types onto the table. Say no to the fact that you can't deploy a weapon outside the point of the war in which it was historically used. And that authenticity, I guess, can often disappoint, make limits for players, and ultimately give some hard choices. Now, none of this means, I guess, that figure manufacturers should not sell or not produce rules, but it should mean that they must go into it with an intent which is about historical accuracy, relevance, and giving a game that is true to the history that they are trying to bring to life through the sales of their figures. We've seen some fantastic advances in figure quality, and there are some fantastic figure ranges that we can get onto our tables, but we must do that in a way which is historically relevant, historically plausible, and that reflects the history, not that creates a different version of a pseudo history that really just plays games out to suit the fact that we can get more toys on the table. Yeah, games potentially become really bloated if we do that. The meaning of the game is diluted, and the decision-making challenges are kind of replaced by a kind of blandness that actually makes me feel a bit depressed if I think about it too much. So we must ensure that we keep games with a high degree of historical relevance. War games are at their best when the rules challenge how you think and not make you think about how much you actually own in terms of your toys. When the designer's loyalty is to history, then I think we get better outcomes. History has already been written. Our interpretations of it will forever change, but new troop types will not suddenly appear out of the ether. We must ensure that when rules are written with the right intent, they don't just tell you how to move and buy more models. That instead they ask you to think like someone who once had some real consequences acting on them for the risks that they take and the decisions that they take on the battlefield. And that's what will give our war games lasting value. I guess that in all of this I am a little biased. I'm a rule writer. I'm associated with a rules writing publishing house. And I think that I am perhaps someone who likes to stick to history. I don't tend to play many fantastical games. And I suspect that there's more temptation to write fantastical rules in support of fantastical figure ranges. In fact, if you produce a figure range that is fantastical, in fact, you've got no choice other than support and produce some rules that go with it. Because if you create something brand new from your own thinking, and that's a fantastical army of some kind, well, I need some way that I can bring that to the tabletop. So you're going to have to produce a set of fantastical rules to help me do that. But please do that in a way that helps me appreciate the history and story you're trying to tell me, and not just in a way that makes me buy the next unit. Well, I think that's probably time now for me to go and hang my stocking up by the fireplace and to sit on the sofa of sincerity alongside the couch of contemplation and to sip myself into a nice afternoon's sleep. See you next time.